This video demonstrates the design and production of segmented wood feature rings. These feature rings are used in a variety of projects such as segmented wood bowls and other projects such as these. These are some examples of projects we've completed with segmented wood feature rings. Projects such as bowls with a single feature ring, another design of a bowl. We've made eggs, segmented wood eggs such as this. This one has two feature rings stacked one on top of one another. This larger egg, which actually has four feature rings in its design. And in the recent project, we just completed some segmented wood bells. This one with two layers of segmented wood rings. This one with a single segmented feature rings. The feature rings are comprised of a variety of contrasting woods of different colors, different contrast, and different layer thicknesses. The feature rings normally have a symmetrical pattern to them, where the top and bottom are the same woods, the same thicknesses. This is really just to save a lot of wood when we're cutting on the table saw, as we'll show a little bit later. These feature rings also usually have a separator strip between the segments, again just to make them stand out a little bit and give a little bit different contrast. Sometimes these separator pieces are single color wood, but in other cases such as this, there's actually three layers of some very thin wood glued together for those separator rings. Another pattern, this with a solid separator strip. And again, another pattern. The process begins with cutting of strips of various varieties of wood on the bandsaw. Various thicknesses of wood from 25 thousandths up to 200 thousandths are cut from the various boards. You can also use veneers for some of the layers, which are 20 thousandths of an inch thick. Often I assemble sets of 3 to 5 wood strips and glue them together. These will later be added to the sets of the assembled strips. I especially do this when I'm assembling pieces of the 20 thousandths to 50 thousandths inch thick boards. This makes later glue up of laminated boards with 18 to 20 layers much easier and faster, since you're up against the clock when gluing many layers before the glue starts to set. The wood strips are then assembled into a suitable pattern, and this is just trial and error to what looks good to your eye. But I try and make the layers symmetrical, that the top and bottom layers are the same. This will just save wood later when you're cutting these on the table saw. After the pattern's been assembled, then we're ready for glue up. The Accu-Slice accessory is used on the bandsaw to produce the thin wood strips. I am starting with wood blocks 30 inches long by 1.5 inches thick by 2 inches wide, from which we will cut the required thin strips. Begin by attaching double-sided tape to the wood board. Then mount the tape board to the Accu-Slice fence and clamp for 15 to 60 seconds to set the tape between the board and the fence. Remove the clamps and position the board next to the bandsaw blade. Then adjust the board position to square off the board for the first cut. Tighten the coarse adjustment screws and the mag jig clamps and begin your first cut. When complete, move the board back to the starting position. Adjust the index wheel to the desired board thickness. Tighten the clamps and begin your next cut. Continue until all the required strips have been cut. Out of that one piece of cherry, I was able to get 9 boards 50 thousandths of an inch thick, 4 boards 75 thousandths, and that last piece I cut off was only 25 thousandths of it thick, and left me about a 15 to 20 thousandths piece left on the fence as waste. We are now ready to begin the design of the laminated boards to be used to produce the feature rings. I have cut more than 200 strips of wood of various wood varieties and wood thicknesses, from 25 thousandths inch thick up to 200 thousandths inch thick, each board 1.5 inches wide by 30 inches long. I've also cut some wood veneers to the same dimensions, 1.5 inches wide by 30 inches long. From some of these strips, I've produced and glued a number of laminated board sets of 3 to 5 layers. These will be used to prepare the final laminated boards for the future rings. I produced enough material here to produce at least a dozen laminated boards, which will produce more than 2 dozen feature rings. From the various wood strips and board sets, assemble a package to your liking. I usually don't have a pattern. No two of my designs are the same. I try to be creative in all my designs. But you want to try to assemble boards next to each other that have some contrast in either color or shade. You start with a centerpiece of wood, usually a single layer of wood, and then you add either single boards or some of your pre-glued sets to the outside to produce a pattern of your liking. Again, being symmetrical in your design. You should always end up with an odd number of layers in the design. In this case, I have 17 layers in my laminated board strip. After the design is complete, you're ready to start glue up. And this is one particular design. I have a couple others I prepared here also. These are ready for glue up. From all those pieces of wood that were cut, I produced a total of 13 groups. These 13 groups produce the laminated boards. Each of these boards will contain between 17 and 23 layers. For all the gluing operations, I'm using Titebond 2 Extend Glue. This glue will give me additional time for spreading glue to all the board surfaces before the glue starts to set. I normally apply glue to both surfaces of the boards. Continue to apply glue and stack all the layers. The gluing jig that I am using consists of 2 1.5 inch by 36 inch long aluminum angle irons. The back aluminum angle iron has been screwed to the MDF tabletop. Then position the glued assembly into the clamping jig in a cradle of waxed paper. Position the front angle iron against the boards. Attach a couple of clamps along the length of the boards to the outside of the aluminum angle irons to clamp the glued boards together. The boards may slide or move slightly when first clamped. Therefore, use a screwdriver or a putty knife to push the individual boards down against the tabletop to get the individual boards as even as possible. Then continue to apply clamps along the entire length of the boards. Note that I alternate the position of the clamps between the bottom and the top of the angle irons. This will assure that I get even clamping of the glued laminated boards. Remove the clamps and get ready for cleanup of the glued joint edges of the laminated board. The edges of the glued laminated boards are normally quite rough with a lot of excess glue and uneven wood strips, so I normally begin the cleanup by passing the glued edges of the laminated strips to the joiner planer. Next, I clean up the edges on the edge sander. The edge sander assures that all the faces of the board are perpendicular to one another. Finally, I run all the board surfaces through the drum sander. The drum sander assures that all the edges are straight and parallel to one another. Using the segmented sled for the table saw, I am cutting segments for 18 segments per ring. I normally use a software program by Woodturner Pro to determine the segment edge dimension of each of the segments to produce the required diameter of ring. For example, to produce an 18 segment ring with an OD of 4.0 inches, each segment should be 0.71 inches wide. However, I will be adding separators between each of the segments, which will be 0.050 thick. Therefore, each of my segments needs to be 0.660 inch wide. I adjust my stop gauge to produce the correct length of each segment. Note, for safety, be sure to raise the hinge stop gauge before cutting each segment. If you forget, the segment being cut will end up flying by your head. Next, the separators need to be cut. The length of the separators is critical. If they are too short, you will have a gap in your finished segment rings. If they are too long, the segment ring will not be perfectly flat when it is glued and put into the press. Before cutting the separators, measure the segment height. Adjust the stop on your saw to permit the exact cutting to this dimension. To cut the separators and other small pieces for my segmented wood projects, I use a small model saw from Burns. This saw is much safer when cutting small pieces than a larger table saw. In addition, the kerf of the blade is only about 1/16 of an inch, so much less wood is wasted. Sanding of the edges of the individual segments is required to remove the fuzzies from the segment edges. This is needed to assure good glue joints. I normally sand the edges with 220 grit sandpaper. After sanding, the segments are arranged into the ring and secured with a rubber band. Next, the separator edges are sanded to remove the fuzzies. The separator pieces are then inserted between each of the segments. The segments and separators are now ready for gluing. Again, I like to use the Titebond 2 Extend glue due to the longer setup time for this glue. Early on, I used the worm screw clamps to make my segmented rings. However, this technique did not produce perfect rings. Usually the hub or the worm gear itself caused a distortion of the ring shape. I now use a taper and rubber band method to make my segmented rings, which can produce near perfect rings as long as the angle cuts of your segments are perfect. To begin the process, a length of masking tape with the sticky side up is attached to the table. Each of the segments and spacers is coated with glue on both sides and set in position on the masking tape. After gluing the last segment, I usually go back and make sure that all the exposed segment edges have wet glue on their surfaces. The edges of the tape are then cut, and the segments are picked up and rolled into a circle. A rubber band is secured around the segments. At this point, I prefer to remove the tape. I found that I get better results by removing the tape at this point, since there is now nothing to interfere with the segments from forming a perfect circle. In addition, it makes later cleanup much easier, since the tape has not been glued to the segmented ring. Continue to add rubber bands to tighten the glue joints until no further glue can be squeezed out of the glue joints and the segmented ring holds a rigid shape. Next, place the glued ring assembly into the press between two pieces of wax paper and tighten the screw clamp. This pressing will cause the individual segments to align perfectly with each other and form the perfect segmented ring. Allow it to remain in the press for at least 15 minutes before removing, and then allow the glue to dry and harden overnight. On a belt sander or disc sander, lightly sand the top and bottom surfaces of the segmented ring. The purpose of this sanding is first to assure that the top and bottom surfaces are perfectly flat, and second to make sure that the segmented pieces and the separator pieces are all flush with one another. The sides or edges of the segmented disc can be sanded on a disc sander to remove the glue and glue stains on the edge surface. This sanding is optional, and I just do it to see the finished project. This video demonstrated the complete design and construction of segmented feature rings. More than 200 strips of wood of various varieties, colors, and thicknesses were cut and then assembled and glued together to produce 13 laminated wood boards, each one of a different design. About half of these laminated boards were used to produce 30 segmented wood feature rings. Usually we are able to obtain 2 to 4 feature rings from a single 30-inch laminated board, depending on the diameter of the feature ring. These feature rings will be incorporated into some projects in the works and will be shown in future videos. The remaining laminated boards will be cut and developed into feature rings as any new project arises. Visit our website to see some of the many examples of projects completed using these feature rings.